you started covering a lot of the foreclosure crisis.
Yeah, and that was my first hint that something like Trump was going to happen. That's what this whole, meme stock thing grew out of, I think, is just this rage directed towards these financial professionals who were basically being subsidized and then acting like they had like this special financial genius that allowed them to make money.
We actually haven't even opened one of the most important chapters in your journalism career yet now, which is the Twitter files. As someone who's actually like interacted with him and feuded with him and has had this relationship with him, where do you think Elon Musk fits into this?
Welcome back to Counterpoints. For today's Friday show, we're going to be joined by longtime veteran journalist Matt Taibbi. I want to talk about his career, which has spanned the pre-internet era, basically. Back when you used to actually print things. I mean, I'm there too, so I can say that.
That's true.
Up to today and continuing to evolve. Like we have not seen, it's not as if we've gotten some static place. So we're going to talk about the history of journalism and the history over the last 30 years. But wanted to start with a question, though, about 2024, this election, which we're all trying to cover. And I have a theory that I wanted to try on both of you, which is that I think the country is in denial right now. Like think of this as the other kind of election denialism. Like people just, I think, as I talk to people around the country, they just refuse to believe that this is the election, that it's Biden against Trump. Like there was basically no Democratic primary. And so that allowed people to kind of say, you know what, this isn't really happening. There's no competition, but it's not gonna be him. Like there's gonna be, and I was talking to my dad yesterday, he's like, they're going to do something, right?
Right.
Maybe at the convention.
Trump goes to prison,
or
Biden
something.
has a medical situation.
And I think the Nikki Haley, we talked a lot about how Nikki Haley got all this mainstream news coverage that she didn't deserve based on the fact that she never had a shot. But I think part of it was psychological, that people were like, it's got to be something other than Trump. Like Biden said he was basically going to be a one-term guy. Country took him at his word. Now here he is allegedly running again. And so I think that the refusal of people to check into the election has to do with them just denying the reality that it's these two guys.
What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. Number one, I think people are right to be suspicious because we're not treating this like a normal election season. I mean, at this, I've covered 5 presidential elections. At this stage of a race, normally every single day would be a campaign story. You see somebody out in the campaign trail. We would have constant arguments about the back and forth about, between the candidates. And there's none of that.
You'd have staff getting fired. Like
yes,
you'd know who the staff are.
Right, yes.
Like they became celebrities over the 5 election cycles that you've covered. Like the Karl Roves, the David Axelrods. Like who's running Biden and Trump's campaigns?
Matt, where was the first publication that you worked?
On a campaign?
Just like in general.
The Village Voice.
The Village.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So because that sounded to me like such a Politico HuffPost question, but that's actually was sort of new, right? I mean, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the aughts, there was this journalism as almost a sport.
Well, like, James Carville.
Campaigning became more almost gamified. I don't know. It's that the characters popped.
I think that was really popularized by Halperin and who's the other guy? I always forget his
Heilman.
Partner. Heilman,
yeah,
exactly. With Game Change and all that, and this whole idea. But that was the first. When I started covering campaigns for Rolling Stone, the first thing that I saw as a big story on the campaign was that the journalists thought they were running the whole thing. There was a kind of a cabal inside the campaign where they would get together at the end of the day. They would decide which candidates were serious and viable and have discussions about that. And I thought that was crazy. Now there's really none of that. I mean, nobody really knows what the campaign is anymore. And it doesn't, there's no script. It's not the reality show that was all consuming for so long.
So 5 elections, I do the math. What was the first one that you actively covered?
04, really.
Right, okay,
yeah.
Kerry
Maybe
Bush.
it's 6, I don't know, yeah. But yeah.
Right, so everybody knew Bush, even though Bush was the nominee, like everybody knew he was going to be the nominee again, Karl Rove. And like and he had a strategy. He's gonna bring out the bigots over marriage equality. Like that was the theme of the 2000 plus. John Kerry's quizzling and he's weak on the war and
Right.
You knew you kind of knew what the election was about.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they made it about things that really didn't matter to the population all that much. I mean, the war was the dominant topic in the country at the time, and neither candidate really wanted to go there all that much. Not in, in terms of, and also the larger issues about the war on terror and that sort of thing. They just didn't come up a whole lot. It was, John Kerry's medals versus, other sort of
the Swift boats.
Swift
boats. Yeah, exactly, all that stuff. So,
how did the campaign press handle the Swift boats? Actually, like, what was the, and then I want to go back and how you got into journalism. And the Bush campaign, they start pushing the Swift boat stuff. And for people who basically weren't even born then.
Which is almost everybody.
So Swift Boat Veterans for Truth was a right-wing group that was kind of formed by people who had served with John Kerry in Vietnam. And they hated his story of turning his Swift boat toward the Viet Cong and shooting. And they said he
they're throwing the medals.
They really hated that he threw his medals in protest.
Right.
Or his ribbons. I think he kept his medals, but he threw his ribbons, which was a very John Kerry thing to do. But they didn't like his Purple Heart. They think he wasn't injured enough or whatever. It became this
He smoked his ribbons but didn't inhale them.
Yes. Yeah. It became this real character attack. Democrats just avoided it for a very long time, not understanding the way that the internet and politics had changed, thought that if they just didn't address it, it would go away.
Right.
It ended up causing immense damage. But I'm curious how the press was thinking about this kind of new way of campaigning.
What I remember about that is that a lot of people saw it as a continuation of the sort of 90s David Brock, which was a new thing.
Brock used to be on the right for people who
he was this
also or not
quote-unquote right-wing hitman back in the day who was the point person behind the scenes in the Clarence Thomas hearings, then Whitewater and all this stuff. And that was sort of a new thing in media at the time, this idea of a organized, multi-pronged media attacks, creating new organizations just for the purpose of going out into the public and creating news stories. And I think a lot of people saw the Swift Boat Group as that. But you're right, there was a massive Streisand effect in the way that, they covered that so much that it became overwhelmingly the theme of the campaign. And the Democrats, I don't think, did a great job of pushing back because their whole campaign was John Kerry in an army jacket. They didn't have an issue to run on. And so this whole thing, he was a sitting duck for that kind of stuff. So I don't know. Most of the reporters just thought it was a fun story that they were happy to work on every day. There wasn't a whole lot of outrage.
Kind of a fascinating thread, though, and this might get to your next question, in that Chris LaCivita, who's now running the Trump campaign, was the pioneer of the Swift boat.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, absolutely. People credit him for the entire Swift boat campaign attack. And what's interesting about that is at the time people saw it as this sort of rupture of ethics. And now you have the man who finally put an end, at least on the presidential scale, to this debate about whether it's okay to rupture the ethics. It's like the filibuster debate, but for decorum in presidential campaigns.
Right.
Exactly. We can't, once you open that Pandora's box, what happens? That absolutely happened in 2016 on the presidential level, and now Chris LaCivita, the Swift boat guy, is running the Trump campaign.
I didn't even know he was running the Trump campaign. I'm in denial too about this election.
I didn't know that either. I'm supposed to be covering this.
So am I. Don't tell anybody that I didn't know that, because that would be kind of embarrassing.
It's a good thing you didn't say it on air.
Yeah. So, it's amazing. Just keep it between us and the Friday show here. If you guys out there watching,
nobody clip this halal flow.
Yeah, don't
keep
clip
this one private.
Yeah. So. Growing up, did you always think you were going to be a journalist? Because your father was a journalist, is that right? He was like a local TV journalist in New York, is that right?
Yeah, so my parents were at Rutgers, and my father, I was born when they were very young. They were 20. And so to support the family, he was working as a newspaper reporter at the Home News in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So he started when he was 18 or 19.
Oh, wow.
He's been doing this forever. And then as soon as he graduated, we moved to Boston and He worked at a local affiliate there, so my childhood was like Anchorman, basically, the movie. I spent a lot of my childhood in those newsrooms with, the bad facial hair and all that stuff. And I used to play with the weather setup and try to pretend with the green screen and everything. It was really cool.
And did your mom get into journalism too?
No. She ended up being an attorney, but I spent most of my time hanging around my father. My father is, he's a journalist, like very old school, incredibly gifted. I was very fascinated by his work because he's a super gregarious personality who could just show up at any scene and get people trusting him and talking to him instantly. And, in journalism, in TV journalism especially, you have to get, a good soundbite, and then you have to be able to knock out a script like really quickly. And he was really good at all that stuff. He did his own editing, even back in the days when it was film, going all that back that far. So I thought that was really cool, but I never thought I would be able to do this. And I also wanted to be a writer, not a TV journalist. So.
And was it that? Oh, so you wanted to be a writer of journalism or novels and
novels? Yeah. So I was kind of a depressed kid. So comic novels were my big escape growing up, and I thought that's what I want to do. I want to be like Elon or Nikolai Gogol or somebody like that, And it turned out I don't have talent for writing fiction, but I didn't learn that until later. And by the time I figured it out, I realized I didn't have any actual skills except the family business. So that's how I got into journalism.
So how do you wind up in Russia?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, so my favorite writers growing up were all Russian. I mentioned Gogol, Bulgakov was another one. I went through this period where I was just reading lots and lots of Russian literature.
Do you think that was from your politics, or do you think your politics came from that?
Oh, I couldn't stand politics. I still can't stand it. Really, the books, I was just really into how well they were written and how beautiful they were. And the Russians have this amazing absurdist view on life, and I was, when you're depressed, you kind of try to lose yourself in that landscape, and the writing of people like Tolstoy, it's so vivid, I wanted to go experience it, and then I wanted to learn the language so I could read those books in Russian. So I went there as a student, and one of the funny things was, in the States—
What year is that?
Probably 89, 90,
okay.
So it was still Soviet. Yeah. So I went to a Soviet college. And, but in America, remember the 80s, that was like the time of Porky's and everything, right? Like everybody was, they spent a lot of time on their appearance, and there was a success culture and everything. And I thought, I hated that. I'm like, I'm going to be a failure when I grow up. In Russia, everybody's a failure, right? So I felt like I fit right in. And it was a cool thing. That's why I ended up moving back there. I thought this place is paradise. It turned out not to be, but it was a great thing.
Well, so you graduated from college and came back to the U.S. And what'd you try first before you went back to Russia?
I didn't try anything. I immediately
started making plans.
So I worked demolition and waited tables, saved money, and just went over there and started stringing. So. And
you said it turned out not to be paradise, but there's something so interesting about someone growing up immersed in, as you said, the landscapes. That was a really beautiful way to put it. And then having your eyes opened up gradually over time. What was that process like? What really started to disillusion you?
Well, Russia it went through a very tough time, both when it was still Soviet and then after the revolution in 91. That's when—
Were you there in 91?
I missed the actual thing by a couple of months on either side, but I saw it coming, obviously. My last semester there, there was a ban on food products, so you had to use a rationing system just to get vegetables and things like that. It was a mess. But then after that, Russia immediately transformed to this like gangster state, which was kind of horrifying to watch. And but as a journalist, it was fascinating. I got to go and see incredible things, and it was a great place to start one's career because you get to cover very high-level things quickly, which you don't get to do in America if you're working as an intern in a magazine or something.
Yeah, I always thought your ability to cover Wall Street corruption later in your career must have been connected to witnessing it in its like most extreme form,
Right?
Oligarchy.
Like up close. Was it so? And for people who aren't that familiar with that period of history, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the most rapid collapse in life expectancy in world history is Russia in the 1990s.
That's probably right. Yeah,
Which is remarkable to consider that they went from rationing food in 1991, and that was the high point.
Right.
Like they collapsed, life expectancy dropping by just years and years and years, because the state, with U.S. facilitation, just gets sold from under the people to these oligarchs.
Yeah. And
could you see it happen in real time? Like, are you there's still these famous videos of Jeff Sachs, who we should have on the show because his arc from that to where he is now is
that's
just absolutely
fascinating to me, by the way.
Incredible. Jeff Sachs helped to basically auction off the entire Soviet Union and create all these oligarchs through this Harvard-run.
The Harvard Institute for International Development, HIID. So the auctions that you talk about, when you mentioned the financial reporting later, these were some of the most complicated thefts maybe in the history of the world, and probably the biggest ones maybe in the history of people. So just to take an example, they had a thing called loans for shares, which was a way of kind of handing out the crown jewels of Soviet industry to basically cronies of the Yeltsin regime. And what they did is they took people who really had no cash at all, and they lent them money. So in the case of, for instance, Yukos, which is a company about the size of ExxonMobil, right? The Yeltsin regime lends one of the banks $50 million, which turns out to be half their stake that they put up to get a 38 or 37% stake in one of the world's biggest oil companies. Yeah, exactly, right. So they put up basically nothing to become instantly some of the richest people on earth. And they did that with, 7 or 8 of these banker groups. And we later learned that there was a kind of a backroom deal that was brokered at Davos, where there was an agreement that they were going to get these properties in return for massively supporting Yeltsin in the 96 election. And that's how Yeltsin went from being at 6% in the polls to actually winning. There were some other things that went on too, but it was a U.S. brokered thing. We helped advise in the structure of all those auctions, which were totally corrupt. And that's it. So that was an early introduction for me to all that stuff.
What's also playing out in a split screen for you is you're seeing up close what's actually happening in Russia. And you're also probably absorbing Western media coverage of what's happening in Russia. And you've written one of the best books on contemporary media problems, Hate Inc. People should read it if they haven't. But watching that, was that also something, because, and this is kind of a rambling question, but I think about Tucker Carlson going to Russia and realizing a lot of what he has been told about Russia is wrong. Maybe, though, sometimes people realize a lot of what they've been told about something is wrong, and it pushes them further to the direction of like not being right on in a different side of the question.
Right.
Like Tucker out of this, that's a phenomenon that happens all the time. So for you, what was it like watching the Western media say, this place is a corrupt nightmare, while not covering the Westerners that are creating the corrupt nightmare, but then also kind of missing some of the story that you were covering with like everyday people? Yeah,
so a lot of the journalists, actually most of them, didn't speak Russian. That was the first thing that was kind of shocking to me. I didn't understand that at all. It turns out that's sort of an intentional strategy, both with diplomats and foreign correspondents for the big bureaus.
What's the strategy there?
So for diplomats, there was a bad experience with China with the Maoist revolution, where the United States felt like the diplomats were too close to the local population, and that's why they didn't get the warning that the revolution was going to happen. So there's a kind of a strategy of switching people out on a regular basis so they don't get too attenuated to the local population. With journalists, I'm not really sure why they do it, but you almost never have somebody who is really in tune with the local population, the language, everything. And I don't know how you cover a country if you don't know that stuff.
Like, I'm trying to imagine a Russian journalist who comes to Washington, D.C. and only speaks Russian.
Right.
And is then translating what's happening in Washington back to a Russian audience. Can you imagine that it would be remotely accurate?
No, it would be a Monty Python routine.
Yeah, right.
Right? You couldn't. It's Borat. It's even dumber than that.
So would they just have to talk to the English speakers?
Well, so that's the problem. So they got almost all of their input on what was going on in Russia from English-speaking Russian politicians, many of whom went to Harvard, like Anatoly Chubais, Yegor Gaidar, Boris Nemtsov, right? People like that. But you went, an hour outside of Moscow or St. Petersburg, and there was like subsistence farming and complete gangsterism. You would go to a place and there would be total barter economy, no cash anywhere, starvation, incredible surges in crime, all this stuff. So I started to do a lot of like participatory reporting. So I would just go from place to place, get a job somewhere, and then just write what's it like to work construction in this place, or work in a mine over here, right? And contrast that with what they were telling people back home, which was that there's this emerging middle class and everything's awesome, and it was really wild for me because I had a lot of illusions about how good the media was, and that was the first time I saw that they just will lie about stuff, and that was kind of amazing to me.
And who would you publish those with?
So I had my own newspaper over there.
So this is Exile at this point?
Exile, okay. Yeah. But I did work at the Moscow Times over there, which is an expat paper. But I wrote for The Nation and some other papers in England. Like, believe it or not, I think I did a couple for The Telegraph, for the Daily Mail. I worked for Euromoney, believe it or not.
He's always been a right-wing hack.
Exactly.
That's what he's telling you.
Going back, that's right, Euromoney. So I contributed. I also wrote in Russian. I wrote for Russian papers, so that was mostly what I did. But the audience mostly wasn't back in the United States, so that was kind of the difference. But it was interesting.
How'd you come about founding the paper? And who was it? It was Mark Ames. Was Zajic an original?
Zajic was later, much later, yeah. So it was really Mark. There were actually two papers originally. For a long time there was this paper they were called Living Here, which was a club guide, because the Moscow Times didn't have a good club guide, and so everybody realized that's how you make money in an expat city, right? Because everybody's clubbing, right? So we put out this sort of trashy club guide, and that was actually doing well. And somebody had the idea to, why don't we just make that the paper? And Mark was the first editor of that. During that time, I was actually playing basketball in Mongolia when this was all happening. I got sick, came home, and they said, do you want to come help do a competitor to that? And I came back and ended up merging with Mark, and that's how the Exile happened.
That's right, I forgot about your Mongolian basketball career. How long did that last?
A season, yeah. I was the Mongolian
Power forward,
Rodman.
or what you?
I'm really, it was really more like a small forward, but I can't shoot. So, but I was leading the league in rebounding when I left. That's my point.
Like you were the top rebounder in the Mongolian basketball league.
I was at 6'2", believe it or not.
Did you have a nickname? Did the
Mongolian Rodman? And I did the whole thing back then. I had hair, and I used to dye it red and have a yellow beard and all kinds of crazy stuff. The owner wanted to drum up interest, so he would ask me to start fights and do all kinds of crazy stuff.
It's really Kenny Powers in Mexico.
It totally is. That's why I went. I wanted to write a book about this, and the whole idea was it was a gag. It was supposed to be Charles Barkley in the Far East, right? And I was going to do it, but I contracted pneumonia in the middle of it, and never got to finish the project. So,
did you ever write about that?
Not really. I wrote like one article for the Boston Globe magazine a long time ago, but I never did the full thing. And now I wish I lost all my notes from that time period, because it would have been a very funny story actually if I had actually written it. Another
lesson that I'm curious about that I imagine you gleaned from those years is the kind of intersection of journalism and intel that I imagine was especially crazy in 1990s, early aughts Russia. But also I feel like has just flourished in recent years, and this gets to a lot of your reporting with the Twitter files, where there's this mundane think tank at Stanford that is looped in to all of these different Pentagon agencies or whatever, all of the alphabet soup from the Pentagon. But I feel like that must have been a water that you learned to navigate probably in Russia too.
Absolutely, yeah. So Russia, when it when it stopped being communist, it did have a very vigorous free press for a while, but it wasn't exactly free, right? Like the system was, you had a whole bunch of different newspapers. Each one was owned by a different gangster. And the people who were the investigative journalists at those papers, they would be handed something, a packet of something that would come from, whatever intelligence service was connected to that mob figure, and they would write up that report. They had a term for it. They call it selling jeans over there. Like somebody just sold me some jeans, because that's what the people on the street used to do in the communist time. So I knew a lot of these investigative reporters, and actually they were right away, they were incredible reporters. They were really good and very brave. A lot of them got killed or beaten or threatened, and they were just unbelievably brave people who were trying to navigate this very difficult system. And I learned a lot from them, and I didn't learn until later that there was probably something similar going on the Western side. Yeah. But certainly on the Russian side, that was the first time I understood that whole dynamic and got to see how it worked. And of course, by the time Putin came on the scene, he all he really did is consolidate. Instead of having 7 different agencies, he basically put them all under the same umbrella. And if you didn't, get in line and publish what he wanted, that's when you got in trouble.
So where did the exile fit into this constellation of papers?
Well, so we were in this amazing place where we were writing in English. American libel law didn't apply to us. The Russians didn't read us.
Where were you incorporated, like business-wise?
Business-wise, we were a Russian business. Interesting. So we were a Russian press outlet. Hang on a second. So we basically had to deal with the same authorities that like a Russian newspaper would, but they weren't paying attention to what we wrote until later, and then they started to. We had some problems with them originally because they would just ask for bribes on tax day. But then I think there were some content issues later on. And then after I left, the paper actually got shut down by the tax police. So.
What was it that brought it onto the radar? When did it start becoming a problem?
Well, Putin was much more attentive to the whole press scene. There were some other Western reporters who had started to annoy the authorities even before he took control. You might remember a guy named Paul Chlebnikov, who worked for Forbes. He got himself machine gunned towards the end of the 90s. And there was a lot of interplay between sort of connected Russian government figures and Western reporters. Increasingly, that started to happen. The Russians started to pay a lot more of attention to that situation at the end of the 90s. And we were, writing very critically of Putin. I was also pulling all kinds of stunts. Like I worked with this Russian paper that actually wiretapped his chief of staff. So they definitely noticed that.
That would wind up on their radar.
Yeah. So there were things like that. But I got out of the country and nothing ever happened to me. I did know a lot of people that, ended up in bad places after he took power. Like I knew Anna Politkovskaya, for instance, not terribly well, but I did know her.
Well, I was just going to say, what prompted you to come back to the States? How did that transpire?
I thought creatively the exile had kind of run out of ideas. We were starting to repeat ourselves, and I got a little bit tired of writing for a dwindling audience. The expat community was shrinking pretty fast. Our ad base was no longer what it had been.
Is that because of the creeping authoritarianism, the economic collapse, all of those together? Like, why?
Well, Putin's big idea was that he wanted to keep capital in Russia. So that diminished a lot of opportunities for Western business. Like there was an immense capital flight out of Russia in the 90s. That was the whole thing. Everybody there wanted a piece of all these energy companies. They wanted to get underpriced, commodities and timber, gold, whatever it was. And those opportunities closed up as soon as they started, not quite nationalizing things, but funneling all the contracts to Russians specifically and not to Americans.
Like you can steal money, but it has to stay here.
It has to stay here, exactly. He literally had a meeting, Putin did, like 4 months after he got elected, where he just brought all the guys who had gotten rich in those privatizations. And he said, look, here's the deal. You get to keep all that stuff if you pledge your allegiance to me. If not, consequences. Straight out of the movie Casino. Remember the money or the hammer scene?
Yes.
Once that whole thing happened, a lot of the Americans just bolted because there just wasn't a way to make cash the way there had been.
And he made good on that threat to several of the oligarchs, right? To kind of check.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about this. In fact, some of my old friends from over there, we were just talking about this because, it's not an exact comparison, but let's just talk about, for instance, the raid on Mar-a-Lago, right? The showiness of that with all the agents and the TV crews and everything. There was something very similar. They raided a television station there with, guys were rappelling through windows and they dragged people out, and one of the oligarchs got rung up on a fraud charge, and then there was another famous one named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was in prison. Now, Khodorkovsky, people presented him as this sort of martyr to good capitalism, but he was one of the people who most benefited from those crooked auctions. So
and my memory was his crime was getting involved in politics.
Yes.
Because he said, keep your money that you stole, but you have to support me.
Yeah, you got to get off.
He wanted to do both. He wanted to keep the money and also be involved in politics.
Yeah, Putin said you got to stay on the bench, and this guy tried to go onto the court, and and that's it.
Put him in a cage.
Right. So as you mentioned before, when you watch this stuff, it's like, going on the ocean in a glass-bottom boat. I mean, everything's crystal clear. They don't hide their corruption in Russia. They just announce what they're doing. And that's an incredible education for a reporter to see that stuff, especially as a young person.
Doesn't it feel increasingly like that's what's happening here?
Yes.
I mean, with your Twitter files reporting, but also just with all of your censorship reporting, everything, it's starting to look like they're almost bragging about censorship opportunities. You just mentioned the raid. Are there other parallels with that period of time that you witnessed in Russia and what's happening now with creeping authoritarianism, censorship? I mean, it's both left and right, too. It's not like it's just against Trump. It runs the gamut. It's just when the sort of security state wants to clamp down, they put their machinery in motion. What other similarities have you noticed?
So the first time I noticed real similarities was when, I had been assigned to the campaign story for Rolling Stone when I got back. They hired me.
It's 04?
03, 04, and they sent me out. And I remember going out in the campaign thinking, God, this is so boring. There has to be some other, compared to the other thing, there has to be some deeper level to all this that can be covered. And it wasn't until the 08 financial crisis and when they assigned a story to me like what happened with AIG, then you start to see the real machinations of American politics. Like we're going to bail out this connected group of oligarchs using state money. We're going to present it to the public as something
noble,
something noble and beneficial where everybody wins. I mean, it was all very, very familiar, that whole scene. And so as soon as, I had a couple of people on Wall Street who kind of walked me through some of the basics. But after that, I'm like, wow, this is exactly the same story. So that helped a lot, I would say.
Were you surprised at the reaction to that long piece you did?
Goldman?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it was unbelievable.
It's like to this day, we're 15 years later, almost. Maybe I'm getting closer to 20 years, and people still know the vampire squid.
Right. Yep.
Piggybacking on that, the right, I remember as like a young conservative at the time, the right, which was in a populist moment, really didn't like you, Matt. you were the subject of eye rolls. You were just this
Why didn't they like
communist?
Why didn't they like going after the Goldman Sachs Wall Street?
At the time, it was really a taboo on the right, even in the midst of this populist moment. And there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Tea Party moment. A lot of people who were opposed to that. There were a lot of people who ended up being opposed to TARP and all of that. But it didn't matter for you, Matt. This is just my impression, but correct me if I'm wrong. The way the right has reacted to you recently is very different than how they did then. Yeah,
maybe originally, but I think that was a little bit of a misunderstanding. Also, I did get some stuff kind of wrong in that first story. Like, I was a complete novice to financial reporting, so I was reporting what I was being told. And as you know, when you do these stories, you're listening to 20 people and you think, well, these 3 make sense, and this, and so I went with some things. And
any corrections? What were the?
No, they weren't like factual errors. They were more like a sort of interpretive. Sometimes I would overinterpret what was going on a little bit. But really, those stories were really not anti-capitalist. They were actually stories about how politically connected companies were getting unfair advantages in the market. And that's why all my sources were Wall Street people. They weren't like people who were being foreclosed on. That came later. And so I was getting a lot of people from hedge funds or from smaller banks who were calling me up and saying, this is totally unfair. Like, they get bailed out, their cost of capital drops, they get to borrow more cheaply, we lose, right? And it's a complicated story, but the reason I think that people responded to it is because financial reporting is not done for ordinary people. There is no, at the time anyway, there was no sort of popular way to explain what was going on. And just the process of saying, okay, if you've never been around finance before, here's kind of roughly what happened. People really responded to that, and it was a shock to us that there was supposed to be only one story, and we ended up doing 10 years of them. So, I mean, that's how that happened.
Yeah, I was at the Huffington Post. Well, I went from Politico in 2008 to Huffington Post in 2009. And when did that story come out?
Probably 2009.
Yeah. And yeah, I remember there was a rare moment where there were several years where we could write stories about the financial crisis and what led up to it, and also how to fix it. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the fight over Dodd-Frank. And they would get clicks.
Yeah.
Like, people were intensely focused on that. I remember I think it might have been 2010, right around the time the Tea Party is popping off, we wrote a piece saying that it might make sense for you actually to just walk away from your home because you're so far underwater. You're never going to come back.
Right.
You can just mail the keys back to the bank. And we set up using what's Meetup or whatever it is. Say if you guys want to talk to people in your neighborhood who were in similar situations, here's how you can do it. And hundreds of meetups happened around the country and they were covered in the local news. Would do 8 homeowners showed up at this Starbucks to discuss whether or not they should just mail the keys.
That's amazing, right? But that probably told you something about the extent of the right. It was such a dark, bleak moment. Absolutely, yeah.
And so then you started covering a lot of the foreclosure crisis.
Yeah, and that was when that was sort of my first hint that something like Trump was going to happen.
Really?
They sent me to cover something called the Rocket Docket, which was
down in Florida?
Down in Florida, in Jacksonville. And there was a group of Jacksonville lawyers who were the first ones to clue into the whole robo-signing problem, where the banks were just sort of kind of willy-nilly making up documents, or they, in place of documents they should have, they would just create affidavits.
And have machines just sign them.
Yeah, exactly. Or people, they would just they would sit there with stacks and signing these things. So I went down there and they wanted to show me how people got foreclosed on, and they dragged these half senile judges out of retirement, and not even a real courtroom. They just put them in conference rooms and had people come in, and the average turnover time had to be like 2.5 minutes. So they would take 2.5 minutes to kick each family out of their home. And the line was like, you know, from the courtroom all the way around the block, right?
How often were the families there?
They were all there.
They were there.
Yeah, they had to. And you know, and they were all across the map, right? They were white, black, you know, young, old, everything. And the level of rage in that room was like nothing I'd ever experienced before.
This is Florida, by the way, right? Which has become a hub of right populism.
Well, I'm not surprised, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because Occupy happened at the same time, and I remember going up to Occupy and thinking, you know, this is interesting, it's great, but the other thing is where something's going to blow, right? Because that's representative of the whole population. And, you know, because 5 million people or 6 million people got foreclosed on in those years, that's a lot of people, you know, and they were ordinary working class people. A lot of them got screwed. They didn't just not pay their bills. A lot of them, you know, got put into exotic mortgage products they didn't understand. They ended up with $8,000 a month bills and stuff like that. And it was horrible. And I knew as soon as anybody figured a way to tap into that there was going to be, you know, some kind of political movement.
And this was a really pivotal moment, and it was also a policy moment. Like, it was a policy choice. And like Larry Summers described it as foaming the runway. You remember that phrase? And I put that in my book because I thought it was almost self-explanatory, and an editor was like, what on earth does he mean by this? And so I realized, like, actually, kind of you do have to unpack this. And so what he was saying is that you could go in and rescue these homeowners. There's something in bankruptcy law known as cram down, where you can say, look, the cost of this home, the value of this home is this now, the mortgage is this. There was fraud involved here. We're going to cram the mortgage down to your home, to your home value. You're no longer underwater. It's like, okay, cool. Now my mortgage is less, and I'm not just throwing money away every single month, and I can afford it, and I'm not going to get foreclosed on. That's a policy choice that was available to Democrats. A lot of Democrats fought for it in the House and the Senate. The White House, because of its economic team, argued against it. They said, if you do that, the banks would too quickly lose capital, and the banks would go under, and they're too big to fail, and we can't allow that. And so the banks are crashing, so you need to foam the runway with the rubble of the foreclosed homes. Because this way the banks just gradually lose money, and their blow is softened as they land on the runway by the bodies of all of these former homeowners.
Unbelievable.
Because you stretch it out then from 2010 all the way through 2016 it's a rocket docket, but it's still, people are fighting, scraping, like making payments, fighting their foreclosures, trying to get the paperwork in. And then they set up these programs called HAMP and
and they didn't really work.
That deliberately did not work, that are supposed to rescue homeowners, but what they actually did is they just kind of guarantee that they'll be in foreclosure, but years down the road.
They even told people to miss payments.
Right, they would say, they would say, what you need to miss payments in order to get into this program. This program will rescue you. So these homeowners would deliberately miss payments on the advice of these program officers, and then they would be hooked in this program, which meant that they were inevitably going to get foreclosed on. But that was good for Wall Street because then the banks would all survive.
Right. Yeah, no, that's unbelievable, right? And you think about how sociopathic that is, right? Yeah. And they used to be able to get away with that because if it's not on the evening news, who's going to pay attention? But I think with the internet, this is why these movements can happen now, because people can start to do their own research and realize, when you're getting thrown out of your house, you will tend to look into things, and find out what's happening. I know I talk to people who would ask questions like, how come they're spending $6 trillion or $10 trillion in the bailout when it only would cost $1.5 trillion to pay off every single subprime mortgage in the country? And then you have to get into answers like, well, then all the people who basically made bets on all of these, debt instruments, some of them would lose unfairly, right? And they would have claims. And it turns out that there's this colossal amount of leveraged
$60
money.
trillion
Yeah, exactly. That all depends on
money.
this, right? And so that's where the moral hazard comes in. And of course, people, once they started to figure out what was going on with that, they were going to get very, very upset. That's what this whole meme stock thing grew out of. I think is just this rage directed towards these financial professionals who were basically being subsidized and then acting like they had like this special financial genius that allowed them to make money. And that is a very bitter pill to swallow, I think.
That's a perfect point about what I wanted to ask, in that there's this faux brick wall that we think of between the culture war and economics. It's like you sort of have culture in this corner, economics in this corner. But when you're saying around the time of Occupy, the rocket docket people in Florida, you're thinking like, wow, there might be something coming out of this. Donald Trump runs for president. Were you thinking of economics and culture in a different sense at that time? Because I was in college during Occupy, and one of the things that just drove me crazy was the way people talked about the people who grew up like I did, like going to church, owning guns, hunting, like all this stupid stuff. Like Duck Dynasty was super popular at the time. And it sounds stupid, but there was this cultural backlash that could have presaged Trump in the same way that the economic backlash could have. And I just want to ask about how much like the meme stock is a great example. It's like both cultural and economic. What were you reading into that kind of thing that was building under the surface that eventually became Donald Trump coming down the golden escalator?
Yeah, I was probably like most kind of liberal, left-leaning cosmopolitan reporters, and that I wasn't that in tune with the other part of the country at the time, which is, I think, a real failing going back and looking at it.
Even despite all the foreclosure work you'd been doing? Or
Yeah, but I mean, look, I worked
put that off to a little compartment? Or?
It's economics.
Yeah, I mean, it's economics. Like most reporters, I kind of naturally sympathize with, the ordinary working person and not the, rich or politicians. But at Rolling Stone, look, you do a lot of the sort of picking on the yokel humor. I mean, that's part of what columnists have been doing since the days of Mencken in this country, right? And I was specifically hired to be that kind of person. I mean, that was my job, I was walking into a very particular gig at Rolling Stone that had been, the predecessors did that. And now I look back at that stuff and I'm kind of embarrassed by it. And once Trump ran and I started to talk to people in the crowd, I did realize that there was this convergence of the economic stuff and the cultural resentment that was really powerful, that I didn't understand all that well. But it was clearly something, like there was definitely resentment about the way they were talked about in the press.
Yeah.
And I remember Trump, he's very clever, right? He would get up there at his campaign events and he would point at us, and he would say, "Look at them, those bloodsuckers, they
vampire squids."
Yeah, right. Basically, yeah. And he would say, they hate me, but more than that, they hate you, right? And look at us, we did look like snobs, and it was a very smart move. And then when you get out and you talk to people and ask, well, why are you voting for this guy, Donald Trump? And he's like, because he's leading you all by the nose, he's getting free coverage, and just his triumph over us was important, and I saw that and I said, wow, that's amazing, and it was also incredible to me that the other reporters weren't interested in that story. I found that incredible.
And to me, it's particularly if you've lost faith in the ability of government to really do anything positive for you, then at least it can make your enemies miserable.
Exactly.
It's like some satisfaction.
The Schadenfreude thing.
At the misery of my adversaries. So you're going into this campaign, you've got Jeb and the whole crew against Trump in the Republican primary, and then you've got Hillary versus Bernie. I'm still, nobody will ever forget Hillary Clinton giving speeches to Goldman Sachs, like in the run-up, like talk about a bubble, like strategic bubble. Like she didn't need that $700,000.
I know.
She was, and I would hope that if she could go back and do it again, she'd be like, you know what, that was a mistake.
politically a mistake, not morally a mistake. She would not say it was morally a mistake.
No, because there is no such thing as morals.
Yeah, no,
it's all cynical.
They're way beyond that.
Strategizing.
These are the titans of industry.
Will to power, and it's like the $700,000 was not worth losing the presidency over. No. Not that did it, but it symbolized for everybody who the Democratic Party was becoming, that they were willing to do it.
Yeah, and they weren't embarrassed about it, right? I mean, I remember the New York Post did a story where they listed her speaking schedule, and there was one day that was just hilarious. She had like a speech in the morning that was like $400,000, and then she had to fly to another country like to do
biotech.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I'm like,
this is like just months before launching the campaign,
right?
Like within months, not years earlier or like. And then there's Bernie. So how much time did you spend on the Democratic campaign trail that year?
Not much, because my editors at Rolling Stone didn't want me anywhere near the Democrats. So
they found him boring, or
no, they were afraid of what I was going to write.
So, interesting.
Yeah, so they much preferred to have me crawling up the backsides of Republicans.
Meaning that you would be vicious to the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, and then later on when I covered the Democrats in 2020, that whole ridiculous 20-person field or whatever it was, I did a couple of stories that were pretty nasty. But
were you still there?
I still at Rolling Stone, yeah. I thought they were great stories. I'm like, this is sort of classic Rolling Stone stuff. And they were like, yeah, I think we've had just about enough of your campaign coverage at that point. So.
Right, because somebody's going to lose an eye now.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It used to be fun and games. Now Trump's here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what you chronicle in Hate Inc. is that these organs of media become corporate mouthpieces. It's not that didn't always happen. I mean, there's always some intersection, but in a different way, in a way that it was like they didn't need to be told by the Clinton campaign to keep Taibbi away from it. They just shared the ideological sort of hesitation. Right?
Yeah, there was at some point, I think we probably all experienced the same thing, where somebody got the memo like in spring to summer of 2016 that this was a new ball game and that we were no longer going to be the detached press corps that we had been in the past. There was no more of this like writing negative stuff about Democrats when that happened, right? We were going to just sort of look the other way.
Meanwhile, the cable networks are giving Trump unending airtime.
Right.
But yes, the memo went out, definitely. I mean, it's a phrase. There was actually no memo that I know of.
There's no memo. There may actually have been one from the Democracy Integrity Project or whatever came before that. But no, I mean, it was unspoken.
I do believe that so there was from 2003 on this robust blogosphere that they used to call it, which allowed all sorts of intra-Democratic Party fighting. Like Daily Coast, for instance, people were constantly at each other's throats over different candidates and different directions for the party, fighting over the war, surveillance, how to take on Bush, gay marriage, marriage equality. Are you for civil unions? All of this robust fight. And I feel like around 2016, definitely after he wins, but heading into the general, the memo went out, that's over.
Yeah.
We're not doing that. I think Alternate was one of those places where this was happening. They were very critical of Democrats. A lot of their high dollar funding just evaporates. A lot of these donors who were Democrats and believed in just the idea of a full-throated debate.
Yeah.
We're all of a sudden you know what? Not right now.
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of the NGOs that maybe occasionally at least still went after sort of Democratic members of Congress. There was none of that anymore. Now we had the full-blown sort of David Brock model of politics where we have an NGO that exists for a political purpose only, right? We're not going to do this institutional, purity thing anymore. And there was, in the press, there was a very influential piece by Jim Rutenberg in the New York Times, who said, I think it was called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism," and the whole idea was, yeah, we used to worry just about what's true. Now we have to be true to history's judgment. So, everybody knew what that meant, right? And the way I got it was I remember I did a story where I interviewed somebody. It was right after the Access Hollywood thing, and I interviewed somebody at a speech he was supposed to go to, but had been uninvited to by Wisconsin Republicans. So I talked to some Trump supporter who his whole family had been union workers. They had always voted Democratic. And now they said, after NAFTA and all that stuff, we've been screwed so many times. We can't listen anymore, and we're going with this guy. And it's just a quote, right? I put that in there, and I got all this. I got flamed on Twitter for using the economic insecurity thing, right? Which is now code for racism or something like that. And I was totally shocked by that. I guess I shouldn't have been in retrospect, but that was wild. Like, this is a real reason this guy's getting, he's succeeding. Why would we not want the audience to know that? I just couldn't. I mean, what did you think during that time? I mean, I'm curious.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was just like Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin, and I lived in D.C. at the time, didn't pick up on it until I was in rural northern Wisconsin, where my mom grew up. I was rollerblading, and I was going all around the neighborhood, and just giant homemade Trump signs on plywood with spray paint. And this was like July, and that's when I was like, it was David Obey's district for 40 years, deep blue district, flipped in 2010, and that's when I was like, oh my gosh, nobody has any idea what's about to happen.
The piece I'm proudest of from that year was in February of 2016 that I co-wrote with Zach Carter. And the headline is something like, it's in the Huffington Post headline, it's something like, "Don't laugh, Donald Trump could win. And like, here's how."
There you go.
And it was...
I remember that. That was you.
Yeah, me and Zach Carter. And we were saying like, you're gonna hear about nothing but NAFTA from here until the election, and we pointed out some very basic things. We said, Wisconsin has a Republican governor, Michigan has a Republican governor, Pennsylvania has a Republican governor, and if he wins these 3 states, then he wins the White House. It may have been Rendell by that time. Like, there may have been a Democratic governor back, but Pennsylvania had Republican governors for like a decade plus leading into that. And we're like, so we just were making this point that, like, look.
How did people respond to this? But that was still okay in February.
February
right? 2016.
Yeah.
The narrative hadn't solidified.
Yeah.
There was no like cancellation attempt.
Yeah.
Because I think people didn't see him as a threat yet.
Right.
Yes.
And so it's okay to say he can win because he can't win.
Right.
So it's fine to make the argument. And then our polling aggregator by November, we had our own pollster. It was called, we bought pollster.com.
Oh,
HuffPost tried to hire Nate Silver.
Really?
They were in a bidding war with Disney.
How did that work out?
Not well for HuffPost. And so they went and bought pollster.com, which was another polling aggregator run by Mark Blumenthal and some other pollsters. And ours was very similar to Nate's, except had a slightly higher certainty that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And so by the time the election came around, all these polling aggregations had her, well ahead. But what Nate accurately pointed out is that if they're off a little bit in one state, then they're probably off in all of them. And so you need to factor that in, and he turned out to be right.
Yeah.
So his was wrong, but he was right that he might be wrong.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think he was probably, if you go back and look at their coverage, they kind of accurately presented the percentage chances and all that. But it was things like, Trump will play in the NBA before he's going to be the nominee. Like that stuff is what told, especially liberal readers, don't worry about it. This is funny, right? It's nothing's going to happen. And they didn't take the story seriously. I got fooled in a different way. I initially did what you did. I said, wow, this is going to work. Like, Hillary Clinton's the perfect opponent for this guy, right? Yeah. Just watching the speeches. But then I went to the convention, and some pollster sat me down and walked me through the numbers and said, look at the likability numbers, right? And I thought, wow, that's insurmountable, not realizing that there were a lot of people who hated both candidates.
Right.
And, if among those, Trump ended up winning 2-1.
Right.
And that was a key factor in that race.
That's really interesting because that's where we are now. The
double haters.
Press wrote about the double haters this morning, or someone wrote about the double haters this morning. That's a good point, Matt. And what do you think, how is it playing out in 2024 when you have some, I think they put it at a quarter of the country or a quarter of voters say they hate both candidates.
Yeah.
Is that the key demographic in 2024? Who wins the we hate both people?
Well, I think that's, they were the key demographic in 2016. It was a slightly smaller number back then. I think it was 19% or 20%. So I would imagine it'd be even higher now. But it's not predictable how those folks are going to vote. I mean, I think there will be more people who won't vote. But having covered campaigns, I always feel like if they have a strong emotion somewhere, it's going to guide them to make the vote. So if they hate somebody more than they dislike somebody, or more than they like mildly somebody else, that's going to bring them to the polls. And there are a lot of people who are they're very wary of Trump, but have a lot of negative feelings about the Biden campaign and vice versa. But I just think it's tended to work out in Trump's favor, when it's like that.
And so after 2016, then when does your Eric Garner book come out? It's called I Can't Breathe.
Yeah, that was 2 years later. Yeah, 2018.
And so that brings us to the height of cancellation time, cancellation period, which brings back your Russia time.
Yes.
How often had
In the culture wars. That book.
How often had the exile been brought up again, in your career? What made it? How did that happen?
So I don't want to be conspiratorial about this, but what I will say is that during it had never come up until 2016, and then I started to notice that whenever I wrote about certain things, it would come up.
What kind of?
When I said negative things about Hillary Clinton, when I said positive things about Bernie Sanders, they came up. But
in the context of the Bernie bro.
Yeah,
meme
often, right? Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So there was a group of, sort of internet trolls, but it's such an inexact science, and I was never able to get a real handle on what happened. I mean,
whether it was coordinated or
right, you can't say that, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I do know who some of the original people were who were trying to make us think about it.
Were they any of the same people that started the birther rumor in 2008?
I don't think so. I mean, I didn't really look all that hard at this, and I spent much more time just being bummed out and feeling guilty, and then I got mad about some of the press coverage that was making some, basically I had written some very offensive things, but there was a scene in the book that it was Mark fantasizing about something, about sort of a sexual harassment scene that wasn't true, and there was no way to talk about it and not sound like there was no way to make sense of it. I mean, unless you had been through the whole Russia thing, the disgustingness of the humor of the exile was never going to make sense to American audiences. So I didn't even really try. But that was really, it turned out to mostly just be a blip in my career. The much bigger thing was the Russia Gate thing. And that was when, I suddenly was on the outside with everybody in the business. And that started before that. So, I don't know.
How so?
So, right after Trump got elected, I had experience with Russia. And I started getting calls about the subject. And I remember looking at some of the early stories and saying, man, the sourcing on this stuff is really weird, right? It's all anonymous. There's no way we can replicate any of this in the lab, And I wrote a piece called "Something About This Russia Story Stinks," really early,
Is it Rolling Stone?
In Rolling Stone, yeah. And all of a sudden, like lots of people just sort of froze me out. I stopped getting, my phone calls returned. People in Congress didn't call me back. That was the beginning for me of. I started to realize that I was not going to be able to stick around in that Rolling Stone.
See, that's also interesting because, again, without seeming conspiratorial, it just feels like it feels like a Clinton op. It feels like you got on the wrong side of the sort of Steele dossier. What's the name of the Wall Street Journal?
At that point, it's not an op. It's the entire culture. It's like.
But being driven by the ex-journal reporters who are feeding it around, and like there was a group of people that was talking to David Corn and all that stuff.
People were leaking things and
it just feels like.
I wish I had known that back then, because all I had was just doesn't seem right. If I had known about all that, stuff, but it was cultural. It was this weird thing that now is normal, which is this groupthink culture, which. One of the reasons I liked journalism early on when I first got into it is that it was not that. You used to go into a newsroom or, a TV, studio, and it would be like a comedy club in the back room. Like everybody was busting each other's chops about everything. You could say anything. Nobody cared what your politics were, as long as you did the job well. I thought that was a really cool feature of reporting. And then like overnight, it turned into the exact opposite. I don't know if you had the same experiences.
Like college campuses.
Yeah. I mean,
it turned into a campus.
I missed that, but yeah.
But it felt like, I went to college campus after they became like thoroughly sanitized, and it feels like that in green rooms now. It feels like you have to watch what you say. It feels like it's very self-serious, and it seems like it wasn't super self-serious before that.
I think the way I handled it, I basically didn't touch the Russiagate stuff. I didn't go either way on it. I was just covering other things.
Right.
So that might have been the way that I just like subconsciously was like, you know what, if I could break some news there, like I think we broke a good story on Elliot Broidy, who was doing like unregistered lobbying for Russia. But like somebody hacked his emails, and we had the emails, and boom, here you go.
Right.
But it's and he was like number 2 on the RNC or something. Like
really?
It's a big
It was like the fundraiser.
Yeah, it was a big fundraiser. Yeah. It's a big story. I think he went to prison. But that was different than the campaign. That's just classic.
Right.
Foreign governments influencing the process.
But that does bring up an interesting issue, though. I'm curious about this, Matt, like how you decide what to cover now. Because having been in conservative media, there's this, like, the entire corporate press is focused on 3 shiny objects. And sometimes they're doing legitimately important reporting. Like, I'm glad that they are, when there's a hurricane, I'm glad they're down there. Like, there's some reporters who are doing good stuff. But conservative media sees its role as saying, they're all doing that. They're getting every stone overturned when it comes to Donald Trump. We have a limited amount of time and resources. We're going to spend them over here. And I feel like maybe that's what you were doing with Russiagate. I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like you were doing the reporting that was coming to you. How do you decide what to report on now, Matt? Because I'm sure you get a lot of stuff that just comes to you naturally, but you also have limited time and resources. So it's not like the people who expect you to spend every day, this is why Donald Trump is evil in a million different ways. This is why I hate Netanyahu. This is why the CIA, well, like other people are doing some of that reporting. You're doing what comes to you. How do you decide where to spend your time and resources?
So I've always had the same attitude about this, which is that the press basically exists more for people who don't have anybody else to press their point of view than for people who have institutional backing already. So going back all the way to the beginning of my career, I always tried to pick stories that nobody else was doing because that's who needs those stories, right? Like, for instance, with we started talking about how Russia was being reported. Well, everybody at home is getting, it's great, it's turning into Switzerland. I would go out and say, look, it's subsistence farming and people getting shot in broad daylight. So I would do those stories. When Obama got elected, I was a big fan of his when he got elected on the campaign trail. But then right after that, I had to cover finance, and he was involved in a pretty shady series of relationships with Citigroup. I did a big story called Obama's Big Sellout for Rolling Stone that I was heavily criticized for. But I think that's what media is for, right? Like, we're not supposed to be in the friends business. We're supposed to do stuff that is true but unpopular. But I do now because so much of corporate media is monomaniacal and in this Trump direction. I'm personally very worried about kind of collapse of civil liberties and things like that.
The small matter of collapsing civil liberties, yeah.
Yeah, I've probably lost my sense of humor about this a little bit, but that's kind of how I pick it. People say, why don't you criticize Trump more? I'm like, we don't have enough people doing that already. Right. Like, there's 5 million people doing that already.
And I think the first time you and I met in person was at a cafe in New York, because you had finished a novel.
Oh God! Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this, and I used to run this with a friend, a little publishing house, because we were like, look, you don't need printers anymore. You can just, if you have a website and you have some books, you could just actually print them. And you had written a novel about a drug dealer, right? And we talked about publishing it, but then eventually you said, you know what, I'm actually going to try Substack. This was a brand new thing at the time.
That was the first time you guys met? I would have thought you knew each other long.
DC. Well, we had been on a bunch of listservs.
Yeah, exactly. We digitally crossed paths.
Yeah, he's in New York, I'm in DC. I also, after I had twins, I basically haven't left the house.
That's true.
Except to go to work.
Also fair, yeah.
So makes sense. Makes sense.
And so you ended up doing it through Substack, kind of serializing the novel. Like, what was that experience like? And you were still at Rolling Stone, if I remember. Yeah. How did you decide to make that, like, how did that evolve into your full thing?
So that happened because the only thing I could do legally with my existing Rolling Stone contract that wouldn't have violated the terms.
Oh, it was like a non-compete.
Yeah, it would have been something like fiction on, a serialized book. They let me write books, so I had to write a book. And Substack came to me early, and I got to know those guys pretty well, and it seemed like a really interesting idea. And after the experience of doing that, which I think turned out well, I also wrote Hate Inc. There first, and I thought this is going to work better just in general if I just leave Rolling Stone and do this for a living. So a lot of people ended up on Substack because they got forced out of their organizations. I'm like one of the only people who left out of greed. I just thought I'm going to make more money doing this over here. So that's why I left.
But a lot of people didn't understand at the time that was true.
How are you liking it?
Yeah, I was going to say, how are you feeling about the Substack revolution?
I love it. I think Substack is a great thing.
And when did you jump out? When did you fully launch it?
2019, maybe 2020. Yeah. There are some differences. Rolling Stone, they would give me a story and I'd get 10 weeks to work on it, right? So investigative journalism, it's a lot of work and not a lot of content, Substack has not solved that problem, I don't think. The how do you do investigative journalism and monetize it quickly? It's what it does pay for is like the strong take, and there's actually quite a reward on Substack for writing. People like to, they will pay for something that they enjoy reading just in general, even if they don't agree with it, I found. So like, as opposed to I do a lot of reporting on Substack, that stuff tends not to do well financially, but the well-written essay does.
How do you tell it doesn't do well financially? Like, people are unsubscribing, or it's people aren't converting from the free to the paid?
You can see how many subscriptions you get. I try not to look, but you can see.
And so if it's a well-written piece, then that converts more people.
Right.
And you get more, I see, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I generally there are like 9 different types of things that I do on the site, and I know which ones get, are monetizable and which ones aren't.
How do you balance out how often to
I feel like
do
Ryan's
one or the
trying to
other?
get tips.
Yeah.
Well, I think one pays for the other. You have to do some of those op-ed pieces.
One for the studio, one for you.
Right, exactly.
Well, it's something we've thought about a lot here, with the whole idea of audience capture.
Yeah.
And the way that we've sort of, the way that we solve it here is we've got Emily's wrong takes, my right takes.
Exactly.
And then people get to hear them both and then decide for themselves. But it does acculturate the audience to difference of opinion and being okay with, like, I say some dumb things sometimes, believe it or not. And but it doesn't mean that you have to go running for the hills.
Right.
It means you can just flame me and just say Emily's great and move on. But that's very unusual in the media space.
Well, it doesn't need to be, though, because I'm sure, as you've discovered, audiences are much smarter and more forgiving than people give them credit
open-minded.
for. And open-minded, yeah.
Even partisans.
Yeah. So, I mean, like last week I did a piece about a writer for the World Socialist website, a Trotskyite who's in prison in Ukraine, and there are some conservatives who subscribe to my site, and they weren't mad about it, right? They're not going to unsubscribe because of stories like that. You will occasionally lose people over something that you say, but over time, I think it evens out as long as you do good work.
I've heard from some people, I think, I shouldn't say because I don't remember if I was told this on or off the record, but that people on the left.
Let's go with on.
Let's go with that, yeah. But people on the left who developed sort of center-right audiences, or maybe even like populist-right audiences during the Trump years, as soon as like Trump was out of office and then there was October 7th, they hemorrhaged. But then people kind of slowly came back.
Well, I know Glenn Greenwald and Lee Fong have talked, I think, openly about that like, because they picked up right-wing audiences, not totally right-wing audience, but a significant chunk were right-wing because they both agreed on the people that they were attacking.
Yeah.
But then they realized after October 7th they didn't agree on Israel. Glenn has, I think, lost a substantial portion of his audience, but he has such a massive audience that it doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, how do you think about that?
Or do you?
I try not to think about that. I haven't done a lot of stuff on Israel, but I never liked that story. I've never been there.
When you did the show with Katie, how often did that come up? Because like she's big into
Katie's
it.
Big issue.
Katie Halper,
yeah. Katie Halper.
Yeah, so we
used to post a podcast with.
Yeah, so Katie obviously cares a lot about that issue. We had a lot of guests on who would talk about that issue. I have written about it in terms of things like censorship.
TikTok, you wrote about it when it came to the TikTok bill.
Right. And so, we had people like Ali Abunimah on, and, that was after, I believe it was Electronic Intifada had been suppressed. And I had written about that even previously. So had Glenn. Glenn was one of the first people to write about that. I don't mind talking about certain aspects of it, but I find the whole thing super complex, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm always very nervous about subjects where I just feel like there are gaps in my knowledge. I remember being on one of the first times I was on like CNN. They asked me a question about like Lebanon, and I just had to say, I don't know. I'm not confident to answer that question. And you could tell the camera hates that answer, right? It's it's a weird place to be, but so I stick with what I do know.
Well, yeah, I just think it's interesting because I do find that even hardcore partisans are more open-minded. There's some that aren't. And I feel like the country right now is 30% hardcore partisan left, hardcore partisan right, and then everyone else is just like, please, I just want to believe something. Please just tell me the truth. Like, I don't care if you're left. I don't care if you're right. Just tell me what you think, and I can make that decision for myself. But like, just do the research and be honest about where you're coming from, which leads me to think, like, if tomorrow the New York Times and the Washington Post said, we are doing journalism from a clear liberal perspective, it would go like leaps and bounds towards restoring trust. I don't know. But I feel like that's why people subscribe to Racket.
Right. Well, yeah, they trust me to probably admit when I get stuff wrong or, you know, tell them where I'm coming from. But audiences are much, I mean, this is my experience going back decades. People always think that audiences are dumber than they really are. If you go back to the 90s, remember the whole lad mag movement we had in the States where everybody thought that you had to do you know, stories in 400-word boxes and that people would not read anything longer than that. And, you know.
You mean like Axios?
yeah, right. I guess that's the idea there. I'm even going back into the Stone Age when it was still paper.
Yeah.
But, you know, at Rolling Stone, when we started doing those finance pieces, I'm doing 8,000-word pieces about credit default swaps, and people love it, right? Like, as opposed to, you know, trying to dumb it down for people. I think audiences like it when you respect them and treat them like adults, and you know, don't make assumptions that they're not, you know, they're going to run away if you try to be complicated. So I don't know. Do you have the same thought?
As I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking the people on the left who think like that you've betrayed them, that you've left the left. You know what happened to Matt Taibbi?
Or that you've sold out. It's all for clicks or whatever.
Do you think your politics have changed, or do you think that you actually haven't been that political to begin with? Or how do you think about that? Like, because I'm sure you still get people.
Oh yeah, all the time.
You can only block
Ryan.
so many.
It's just like what happened to you at Matt Taibbi?
I get that question. It's the most annoying question on the planet.
Right.
What happened to you?
Yeah. People send that to you.
Even me. Like, I haven't changed in 20 years.
It's probably Sagar.
But that's because there's within the business, even small transgressions now are unacceptable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I used to all the time do large, you know, feature-length reports that were critical of the Democratic Party in Rolling Stone where they didn't like it. Mm-hmm. And that was considered a virtue in the business once upon a time, like you know, we're going to criticize Republicans, also do this. I don't think my politics have changed that much. I'm probably a little bit more, I've probably changed a little bit in terms of things that I worry about, like caricaturizing audiences. But I see this, like, for instance, the censorship story, and even some of the other stuff that's gone on with Trump as a continuation of this sort of degradation of civil liberties and, you know, due process that started with 9/11, which I was very sensitive to because I came into it after watching Putin come to power and seeing, you know, all of that disappear in overnight there in Russia. I think it's all the same story. It's just that the people who are now advancing this idea that we have to become more aggressive in how, you know, in the use of illiberal tools, I think it's just a different group of people, if that makes sense. Is
there anything you would say you have learned from the right, or you've been like humbled by as you've made, because I mean, like, I'm in way more left spaces than I ever expected would be in my career. I absolutely love it. And I feel like I learn so much from it every day. Is there anything over the last, maybe 10 years, you feel like maybe that hasn't changed your principles, but that's changed your perspective from spending more time with people on the right?
For sure. I'm much more conscious of how uniform the messaging is in like pop culture. I probably didn't notice that before. Like even shows that I like and still like, they just hit you over the head with the same messages over and over again repeatedly. And now, you know, I can imagine as a Republican, it would be very frustrating to turn on the TV every single time and see myself portrayed as the dumb and wrong one, always, right? And I'm maybe a little bit more in touch with that than I ever have been. But people, you know, people caricaturize my audience as right wing now. It's really not that. Most of the people who subscribe to my site are like old, disappointed liberals like me.
Yeah.
And there's just enough of those people to support my operation, I would say. But yes, I think I've learned quite a lot. And I go back and look at some of the things that I wrote over the years, and I'm a little embarrassed by some of the ways that I characterized people in the past.
I think it's hard to even like overstate how important that was, especially to people who are like my age. Like one of my favorite shows was 30 Rock. And 30 Rock was doing this dual-tiered like economic satire that was brilliant at the time about like Comcast and Cabletown and consolidation and all of that. But it was still it's not the most important issue in the world, but for people like me, it was just like, come on, man. Like,
right.
These are good people. Like they're normal people. And it just was really animating. And I understand why a lot of people voted for Trump as a result of that, or just were able to hold their nose and vote for Trump as a result of that.
The one thing we didn't talk about yet, you and I were almost sort of colleagues with the old racket, the racket thing.
Yep. So
I still work for The Intercept, which was set up by Pierre Omidyar. Mm-hmm. And when he set it up, he originally was going to do 12, as I was told the story, 12 magazines.
Mm-hmm. Then it was 2.
There was going to be The Intercept, was going to be the investigative, civil liberties, national security, and they were going to do sports. They were going to do basically a Condé Nast, but for the internet in the digital media era. And you were going to run Racket, which was that named for what's the Smedley Butler?
No, we just liked it was Alex Perrine and I at the time.
And it was going to be like investigative business, right? Yeah.
It was,
and the stories I heard of The Intercept in its early days are just utterly hilarious, and it's shocking that it ever got launched.
Yeah.
Yours didn't get launched.
Yeah.
Like, how long were you there before?
Like 7
everybody
months.
Gave up that. Yeah, and it never published a thing, right?
Yeah, no, careers were destroyed. Like, people had nervous breakdowns, and we never published a word.
Like First Look Institute or whatever, First Look Media, whatever it's called, just one of the most ridiculous organizations ever.
I mean, there's so many things. Like, I remember walking in there, and there was a person who came into work every day and just sat in an office and never did anything, and was like paid this enormous salary. And it was like months before I asked what was going on with that. and there were so many things like that going on at that organization.
2014?
Yeah, it was 2014, and
you left Rolling Stone for it? And then you went back to Rolling Stone?
I went back to Rolling Stone, on my knees, because they had been kind of.
You left as a hero, like, I'm launching a brand new publication, like
the new frontier.
Yeah. 7 months later, you're like, hey.
I defied Jan Wenner, right? Jan can be a difficult person, and I thought he was dicking me around at contract time, and I was like, I'll show you, like
I'm gonna make it big.
Yeah, I'm gonna go make it big, and I ran off to and somebody even richer than you, and they were going to invest $250 million in media. Then I get there, and it's like, we don't have money to buy a pencil, right? At The Intercept, literally that happened. And
there were rumors that Pierre himself was like doing expense reports in the very beginning.
That's probably true. Yeah,
it's like the 8th richest person on the planet.
It was.
He's like, you really needed to take a cab. You got the subway right there.
It would have been faster.
Actually, I can tell a story about that. They had this idea that we should not use phones, right? And that we should only. The only time that we should ever be talking on the phone is in one of those booths that they now set up, right? And I said, journalists need to have an actual line, right? Because we need to record conversations. And he's like, yeah, but you can do that digitally. I'm like, it doesn't really, that doesn't work all the time, why don't we just have phones, right? And it turned out to be like a cost thing, but they were like hyper focused on stuff that really didn't matter. Like, I got in trouble with them early because they wanted to do assigned seating, because they had this theory that there would be increased productivity with an open newsroom with people. And I said, this is a humor magazine. If I went into this group and I said, you all have to sit in a certain space, I would lose face immediately with these people. And so that thing went down south quickly. but yeah, it was so that's right. We were almost colleagues. That's interesting.
I didn't get there till 2017, so I missed those early days, but I got to hear the stories.
Yeah.
And we took on some of the people who were at Racket, like
right.
John Schwartz, and
yes.
I think some others.
Before we wrap here, we actually haven't even opened one of the most important chapters in your journalism career yet, Matt, which is the Twitter files. And there's been, you've talked plenty about Elon Musk publicly. You've talked about the process in really interesting ways that I think people can go and listen to. I'm curious, with all of this context in mind, Russian oligarchy, financial crisis, censorship apparatuses from the Pentagon to CIA and all of that, where do you think Elon Musk fits into? He's such an interesting person, like whatever you think of him, genuinely an interesting person, but obviously is a defense contractor, is now the owner of a media company. Ryan's reported on how that's gone in different ways with censorship in countries that Americans don't pay much attention to, quite frankly. As someone who's actually like interacted with him and feuded with him and has had this relationship with him, where do you fit him into this?
That's a great question because, as you both know, like when you do any story, you want to understand your sources and what where they're coming from and what they want out of the situation.
Right.
I even asked him, straight out. I said, "What is it you're looking for out of this?" And he sort of said something about trying to restore trust with Twitter's audiences by opening the vault on different censorship practices, but it was such a big step no CEO has ever done anything like that before, right? So I can't say that I ever understood where he was coming from or why he was doing anything. And then shortly after we started, there was that incident where he banned a bunch of people for the jet thing,
jet, yeah.
Right? And we had conversations back and forth about it, and I made the decision right away, which I've been criticized for, but I thought, it doesn't matter, right? I'm not writing about that stuff. Like he's giving us access to all this material. The story is the material. I'll worry about Elon and all of his problems later.
The private jet.
Right.
You have access to this trove of information about the Intel apparatus, and you're going to throw it away for a private jet story. Right,
yeah. Like, I felt like I understood that there were people who wanted the project to end. There was all kinds of strange stuff going on inside that whole scene at Twitter early on, where from day to day, minute to minute, we didn't know whether it was going to continue. And so I was one of the people who was sort of lobbying for, no matter what we do, let's just keep getting stuff in until we have a story. And so yeah, I can't say that honestly that I understand what Elon's motivation was, but I have to give him credit because the stuff that we did get was historic and interesting, and will probably continue to be interesting in different ways, even years from now, as we keep going through it.
You don't talk to him anymore, right? Like that bridge is burned.
Yeah, unfortunately, I still think he misunderstood the whole situation, I think.
That was over the Substack Twitter thing, right?
Yeah.
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 Is he still crushing Substack?
Which anyway proves your point about source management, which is an important part of doing good journalism, is knowing when to push and when to pull. And that proves your point that when there's a level of sensitivity with a source and you're going to lose access to information that's in the public's interest, you have to be smart.
Yeah, well, there's a line, right? Like you can't soft pedal your coverage of somebody in order to get something. Right? That's like access journalism. There's a word for that, right? The Twitter files, look, ethically, it was a unique situation, I would say. Like I consulted with all kinds of people, like some of the old dragons in this business, how do you deal with something like this, and I don't think we crossed that line. I still think that the idea was that there was stuff in these documents that even Twitter and Elon didn't understand, that we were still getting up until the very end, and that was more important than anything else that was happening. So,
Is there more in there, you think, or like?
I think so. I mean, not a ton, but we do keep finding things, and as
You still have access to the ones that you got?
yeah, I'm not supposed to, but yeah. But yes, and there are agencies. When we started, one of the problems was we didn't even just know the names of these different agencies, what they did, like which acronyms meant. CISA, yeah, exactly, like CISA. That's a long story, but there's a lot of stuff like that in Twitter, especially in attachments that we haven't opened and looked at.
Interesting.
That as we continue to do that, every now and then we'll find something. Like Schellenberger's still looking pretty closely at all that stuff. So
Wow. I mean, I don't envy you for having to parse through all of that, but in the other way, it's a story of a lifetime.
no, it's awesome. Are you kidding? I mean, it's a dream. I mean, as soon as we saw like FBI flag this, DHS flag that, I knew.
Jim Baker.
Right? Yeah. I mean, this maybe once in a career you'll get something like that, and it turned out to be, a really big story about this subterranean relationship with the intelligence agencies, and it was very hard to work out, and that's always fun as a journalist, the challenge of it. So, but I have some resentments too, because I do think that some reporters who dismissed it early on because they can't stand Elon, kind of missed the forest for the trees there. That it wasn't really a partisan story, and they should have been looking at it. But I think it's a net plus overall. So.
Anything else?
I mean, I could keep going.
Else?
I could double the time of this. It's been so interesting, and you two are people I've learned a lot from just watching you guys do amazing reporting.
Oh, that's nice of you.
Actually, I do have a question for you both. I mean, like this concept of Crystal and Sagar obviously did it too. Part of the whole idea is to go against the whole thesis of like the hate Inc. thing, and see how it works when audiences aren't just being cheering sections, but. I mean, how is it working for you? I mean,
I think it's working shockingly well.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite pleasantly surprised at how well it's working.
Yeah.
One thing that was very heartening, actually, because one thing I'd wondered about was, there's this whole, you can't platform odious views.
Right.
And here's the platform for Emily and her odious views.
It's like fully anti-abortion, for example. Yeah.
And so
it's not easy for you.
So I went to the GW encampment, the Gaza encampment a couple weeks ago, whenever that was happening back in May, and it felt like everybody there watched the show, like every single person there. So at least if you're in your teens and 20s at this point, like. It's fine. Like, people are okay to hear different views, because also you're going to hear stuff about the Israel-Palestine on our show that you probably won't find elsewhere. But those people are okay hearing right-wing views that they don't agree with.
Right.
They want to.
It was interesting how concentrated the audience was there. It's like, wow, everybody here watches this show. It's amazing.
That's great.
It's really.
That's great. That's heartening.
Yeah. So, I think, people can answer in the comments section if they agree whether it's working or not. But if they're in the comments section, that means they're
that's right.
They're
heads.
heads.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I mean, not necessarily, but I would go back
not
to
necessarily fans. That's true.
Right after the Dobbs decision came out, you and I were on the show together, and I just feel like, as someone who grew up when media was falling apart, like, you just want the transparency, and it's almost efficient to get both perspectives in one sitting. You can hear the best argument from the left and hopefully the best argument from the right, from people that you trust are acting in good faith, and it's kind of efficient. You don't have to.
Yeah, I've met a decent number of people who say that they watch both CNN and Fox, or Fox and MSNBC, because they don't trust either of them.
Right.
But they want to hear both.
Yeah.
And then sort it through themselves. And we just cut out the middleman. You can just
you can get it. Yeah. One-stop shopping.
There you go.
Awesome. Excellent.
Fascinating.
Emily, Ryan, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming down.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching, everyone. This does it for us on today's edition of Counterpoints. I finally found the camera, Ryan. I was like, which camera is it? But it's right here. Make sure you subscribe, breakingpoints.com, so you get this show early and all to your inbox right away on Thursday nights.
There you go.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.